Well, hello, my singing friends. I'm Joan, and by popular demand, this is the video tutorial for version 2 of my singer's mask. The pattern is found in the description box below the video, so you can click on that and print up the pattern. And also a video that I did earlier that spoke about my version 1 and the thinking that got me to this version 2 can be found also in the description box. So go ahead, go click on the link for the pattern, print up your pieces, and let's get started. I've laid out here everything you need for this mask. I've cut the pattern pieces and pinned them to the fabric. I'm using what's left of an old cotton sheet for demonstration. These two pieces here were actually designed as one single continuous piece. And the reason they're cut on the fold here was simply so that they could fit on the page of a PDF document. But what you might like to do is actually cut two of these pieces and to stick them together, especially if your fabric has a design and you want to set your pieces in this direction. It will be a lot easier if you stick the two pieces of paper together. I've already cut the interfacing here. You want the Goldilocks of interfacing, not too thin and certainly not too thick to muffle your sound. Do not use fusible interfacing. Use the kind that you actually have to sew in place. We will not be fusing it because in addition to providing structure, it will also serve as the casing for the zip tie. This is the 14-inch plastic zip tie that will sit in the middle of the front of the mask. You'll also need two 7-inch strips of elastic. These are a 1/4-inch elastic, and you'll want to test your elastic. Different types of elastic have different stretch. And if you're making these masks for other people, you might consider using the kinds of toggles or beads that are used to adjust the ear loops. You'll also need a 3-inch wire for shaping the nose part of the mask. The first step is to sew the casing for the nose wire. It's a good idea to press your fabric so that the fold stays in place and mark your stitch lines. Just pin the area and sew one short side and one long side. I'm using a green thread so that all my stitching is visible on the video, but of course you will use a coordinating thread. Now it's time to insert the wire into the casing, right to the end, and then we go back to the machine to stitch it close. I suggest you use a zipper foot, and this will allow you to stitch very closely to the wire but without catching the wire. But the final step for now on this piece is to stay stitch the front curve of the mask at about a 1/4 inch from the edge. This helps to keep the fabric stable because curves are on the bias and the fabric will lose its shape. This is what the stay stitching will look like. Now our next step is to take the other curved piece and to stitch along this edge, not the deep edge, but this is the edge of the chin, and at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and to stitch all along this edge. Next, you're going to trim away some excess fabric down to about a 1/4 inch. Once you've cut all of that, because this is a curve, we need it to move well, so we're going to notch the edges like so. This is your right side and this is your wrong side on the inside of your mask. Now we'll want to really press out this seam, but there's also a way to keep this seam very stable, and that's to top stitch the underside of the chin. And here is the underside of the mask that's been completed. So this is the top stitch that I did. This will be underneath, close to the skin, so you won't see this seam, and of course you'll be using a coordinated thread, so it'll be even more invisible. But what I want to show you is what it looks like on the inside. So I sewed all the seam edges to one side, and it creates this very clean edge. And of course it does need to be pressed just to give it a good finish. So that's how you do that really nice clean edge. Now the last step for now on this piece is to do the same stay stitching that we did on the top piece. Now we're moving on to the front of the mask. We're going to make the casing for the zip tie. This is the 14-inch plastic zip tie. Take a piece of one of the pieces of long fabric and your interfacing, and you're going to put them together. Remember, this is not fusible interfacing, this is just simple sew-on interfacing. This will be the wrong side of your fabric, and on the other side would be the right side of your fabric. Next, you will measure and just draw a dotted line down the center so you know exactly where your zip tie is going to go. So you would have your zip tie going along the center. Now you need to determine where you're going to stitch on either side. I haven't given measurements because you might be using something of a slightly different size. So it's just a matter of taking the time to measure how wide this has to be to let the zip tie slip in nice and straight. I'm going to sew one long edge, and then I will measure and determine where my next long stitch will be. I have now sewn both sides of the casing for the zip tie. So it's worth doing one last test before we move on to the next step, because this is a point of no return. Now the zip ties typically have a slimmer end just for ease of use. Be mindful of that because that end will eventually be cut off. So it's the thicker part that actually has to fit through the casing. So I'm going to now insert it, and so far so good. I can zip it through. So I'm going to take the zip tie out. It's much easier to sew without the zip tie in. And we're going to start finishing this front end. So you'll take your second bit, you'll leave the basting in. It just helps keep everything together. And you will place wrong sides together. This is your right side on the outside. You're going to pin it all in place, and you're going to stitch at roughly 1/4 inch just to keep everything in place. We're stitching the sides, the long sides, but not the narrow side that stays open. Now we've stitched all the 3 pieces together with this 1/4 inch seam on either side. Everything is nice and secure, and I've removed the basting. It's no longer needed. Now we need to do a bit of marking. So you need to mark the center of your strip as well as the flaps as they're indicated on the pattern. So you want to indicate where that flap starts and ends, and that's simply your finishing flap to finish the mask. So we need to connect these circular pieces to the long piece, and this is where things get tricky. So you need to mark the center on this piece as well. We're going to be doing a French seam, and a French seam is a double seam, and it encases all the raw edges. So rather than sewing the traditional way of putting right sides together, we're going to put the wrong sides together for this first step. So we're going to line up our center like so. So I'm going to pin the center and just keep that nice and secure. It's a lot of fabric to pin through. Now we need to make sure that the edge, this particular edge, goes all the way to the notch, to the marking of the flap, and we're going to pin that in place. You can see that things are a little wavy, And this is because we're lining up a curved edge with a straight edge. What I like to do is I take the center of what I just pinned, which is roughly about here, and I'm just going to match it up and pin it. And then I'll just keep doing the same. So as you can see, I have pinned all along the edge. I've used lots of pins to just hold that in place. And I'll be stitching with the upper part facing up so that I can nudge some of this fabric through my presser foot. So just a reminder, we're doing a 1/4 inch seam. Start from the middle and work your way out. Stitch slowly, take your time. It's worth just taking the time to do this right. So I've just finished sewing through all those pins, and I've sewn that 1/4 inch seam. What I would suggest first is that you do notch the edge of the flap. You don't want to trim that, or you don't want to trim this piece away. You're just working on trimming this area. So you're only going to trim roughly down to 1/8, just like that. I have now trimmed away all the excess fabric down to roughly 1/8 of an inch, close to the seam that I made along the edge. So we're going to flip that and put our right sides together, and we're just going to work the seam through a bit. It's a bit awkward to do a French seam on so many layers of fabric. And then you just sort of roll that into place so that you get a feel for having a piping inside that area, and you will stitch again at a 1/4 inch. So I just finished sewing that 1/4 inch seam, so it's really starting to look quite clean. Flip it over onto the right side, and that piping that is created by the French seam gives it a lot of structure. So now your next step is to do exactly the same thing you did with the top. You're going to do it with the bottom. It will be the same process. So if you're not sure, just backtrack and listen to the video for the top part. So I've now sewn both top and bottom pieces to the front of my mask. Now we have to finish the side, one side of the mask. And I'll start on this side. We have this flap. We'll fold in the side. It was a good idea to notch them a bit when you were sewing before. So we fold them in, and fold them in at a bit of an angle. It'll just make a cleaner finish when you finish up the whole mask. So fold either side towards the middle. That will bring also the piping towards the middle. That's what you want. And then this top bit is going to fold halfway. It's just going to meet the piping right up to there. Now you can take that to the machine and just stitch in place. Okay, I've done that quick seam here just to keep things secure, and now it's time to attach the elastic. So on one side, not directly in front of the piping, because this will get flipped over and you'll have so many thicknesses of fabric to sew through. Just offset it a little bit, just like that. Just tack that in place by hand, just to keep it in position, and then you can take that to the machine and just secure it in place so that it's nice and solid. Once you've done that side, you can then loop the other side over. As you can see, I have secured my elastic in place. Now it's the last flip over before this side is completely finished. So you'll find that it flips over quite naturally given the bulk of the fabric, but there's a few important things to keep in mind. Remember that we're going to have a zip tie going through this channel. So when you flip this over and you stitch this flap in place, it's important not to stitch right through. Okay, so I've finished attaching the elastic. This was the final fold, so we have a nice finished edge on this side. The elastics are tucked away inside. You just pull them out and they'll go behind your ears. So now's the time to put in our zip tie. And just if you remember at the beginning of the video, I mentioned that we have a thin edge on the zip tie. And so we need to cut that off so we have the thicker part supporting our masks. And then you have a nice piece. And then you simply need to separate out your fabric and find your gap and then simply put it through the casing and slide it through. So of course you won't be sewing through the zip tie. You do need to cut off the excess. So basically you're going to measure from one edge here to there, and you're going to determine how much you need to cut off. So now I'm going to tuck that away inside the casing, make sure it's nice and taut, and then we'll proceed to finishing off this edge just like we finished off the other one. Well, there you have it. Your singer's mask is complete and quite comfortable, just like the first prototype. So there you have it. Hopefully one day we'll all be able to flip these off and throw them away, but for now we have some tools, and so I just wish you great health, stay safe, and just keep making some music. Bye for now, and hope that you enjoy these masks, and please put your comments below and all your suggestions so that everyone can benefit from this homemade mask.